Saturday, everybody. Oh, we're being recorded. Yay. Happy Saturday or Sunday morning or Saturday, whatever it is. Um, Here we are back on our intermittent schedule with, I think, session 102. It's good to be back. It's scary to be back. I don't remember how to do any of this stuff anymore. We are, and as I mentioned in the pregame warm-up, that the scheduling is really bad. My apologies to U.S. soccer fans because the U.S. is playing in the World Cup right now. I got to watch the first half as we fell behind the Netherlands 2-0. And we may get some live updates from Gail in the back, who's watching in the back on the other end of this room, where it's currently halftime. Oh wow, Clint's gonna join us. Great. We have two presenters this time who frequently talk about the good old days. And we're going to talk about the good old days again today. Although we have nothing to say because we spent a few hours yesterday talking about the good old days. Now we're spoken out. But there seemed to be a bit of interest in history, in nostalgia, and in talking about all the new calls or that used to come, the flow of calls, why, what, where. And we hope you guys are interested in that too. But we are going to, today's presenters are Clark Baker from Massachusetts and yours truly, Don Beck from Massachusetts. And should we flip a coin, Clark, to see who's going to start?
Yeah, let me start and then you should interrupt and add to some of the things. And I would like to share my screen.
Apologies, I forgot to, speaking of forgetting how to do this. Okay, you should be able to now.
I see a green square screen button. I'm going to take the big risk and share the desktop and go to this one. So the question is the font big enough and everyone can see what I'm presenting, correct?
Looking good to me.
Okay, so we're hoping that by the end of this talk, you'll better understand where and when and how we got all of our square dance calls, or at least to the best of our ability explaining that. And before we get started, I need to say a little bit about what is a call. A square dance call is just a phrase that when you say it as a caller, it has an associated dance action. And you generally expect the dancers to be able to do it. And sometimes they're, English words and so forth. In the old days, I think they used to be called basics. And where is all the knowledge for this talk coming from? Who keeps track of all the calls? The answer is nobody's in charge of keeping track of all the calls. You just have to draw on history and a bunch of different sources, some of which we'll talk about. Why did we have new calls? If you're a new dancer today, you've probably never experienced new calls. It seems like square dancing's been the way you've been exposed to it kind of forever. And I think it's worth reminding people of what a typical Saturday night club dance, as they were called back then, was like in the 1970s and the 1980s, especially with respect to new calls. And at this point, I'm going to have Don describe his experience of either going to or calling dances in the 70s.
Oh, I still see a green square around Clark, not around me, but are you hearing me all right, everyone?
Yep, I have a green square around you.
That's
Yep,
all I
you
need.
sound fine. We just see Clark slide.
What was it like calling in the 60s or 70s or 80s? I did quite a bit of calling then, but I also did an awful lot of dancing. I made a, well, first of all, it was fun, but we had a lot of traveling callers coming through, and I used to enjoy hearing different callers from around the world, and had favorites and had some that weren't so favorite. But one of the things about each dance is typically a caller would introduce a new call, one that um, wasn't around much or didn't hear much. Actually, I wanted to add to what Clark said before, is that Bob Osgood in American Square Dance tried to start standardizing what people are using, and he called the 50 basics and the 75 basics, and he posted lists. And it was an interesting idea, but it was outdated. By the time he got it published, new calls kept popping in, and they weren't the current things. And so when Caller Lab got around to being organized, one of the things they wanted to do is they recognized it's a folk activity and things change. They don't just stay at that list. And so the list was a bit more current when Caller Lab produced it, but then people kept inventing new calls just because, getting back to what I was saying before, when you went off to when a traveling caller came through, one of their shticks was they had to introduce a new call just to make it different. It was a floor equalizer because both the experienced dancers and the inexperienced dancers got a good share at it. And after a while, if 2 or 3 or 4 callers came through and used the same call, locals started using it. And of course, one of the problems was dancers would go and say, "Oh, so and so used this call," and they went back to their club caller, and he said, "I have never heard of it, but I'll look into it because you tell me it's good." And so the local callers both loved learning new things and hated being put on the spot by why all these guys bring in all this new stuff. So the question is, where did the traveling callers get these things? Some of them made them up themselves. Some of them, whenever they'd go into a new town, if there was somebody had something there, they'd ask them, "What's new? What do you got? What can I use?" Then there were the newsletters, the choreographic newsletters that probably half a dozen around the country that people produced that would spread them. And I did that for a while. People would send me their ideas. I'd look at them. I'd try to publish all of them, tried to have a unified way of describing what they were, because the author's version was sometimes kind of interesting. And then I'd pick 1 or 2 that I thought were worthwhile to feature. And some of the traveling callers would pick up the featured ones and carry those around. Clark, what did you want me to say beyond that?
Well, so the main thing is that you'd often encounter a new call at a Saturday dance. So as you said, Bob Osgood in around 1970 had these booklets out, and there was one, the basic 50, and another called the extended 75, which was not another 75 calls, but was just the 25 calls to learn next. And yet there is a book called Burleson, an encyclopedia by a guy named Bill Burleson of Minerva, Ohio, a dancer. And he basically tried to write down everything that he could discover about square dance calls and their author. He didn't do the authors, he just did the calls. And his encyclopedia in 1970 had 1,000 calls, and yet Bob Osgood's booklets only had 75 calls. So why this huge difference? And that gets back to, well, how many new calls are created every year? And basically from 1938 to 1960, as best I can tell, at least written down anywhere, there were less than 10 new calls created each year. But after that, we want to focus on this. So from 1938 till 1994, here's the number of new calls that were created each year. So you could kind of argue that up until about 1960, it was pretty stable. And then something changed, and it's almost linear from 1960 up to 1976. In the United States, 1976 was a bicentennial year, and there was a lot of hoopla made over our bicentennial, including our largest national square dance convention by a long shot, but also apparently a large number of calls created. I don't believe these were created with bicentennial theme names. I just think that 76 and 77 happened to be way up there in new calls. And then it kind of
Clark,
linearly
can
went
I
down.
can I
Don?
share a screen for just a second?
Go for it.
Um,
I will stop sharing.
you have to stop. I have to go to this. I have to find the one I wanted to share. Oh God, it's so small. How can I see? Oh, this is not working out right. Oh, I see what the problem is. Hang on 1 second. That's I'm sorry. I'm going to not share for a second so I can close some of the stuff that's open that shouldn't be open. And there it is. And now I will try to share again. And I thought I had this all set. Never mind, Clark. We had a power failure overnight, and I thought I opened all my screens again, and I guess I didn't, so they're not available. I'll go looking while you're talking. But basically,
Okay.
I have a chart just that I stole from Clark's paper here, but also put some arrows saying when Caller Lab started and when the quarterly selection process started.
Yep, we're going to talk about that.
Okay. All right. Pardon me for interrupting while I go look for some of the other
Okay.
things I had open.
So I note that I don't have accurate data after 1994, but I believe that the rate of new call creation has continued to be low. Certainly between 94 and 2003, I have evidence it's around 20 per year. And since then, I haven't really noticed hardly any new calls being created. So I think it's below 10 a year. So we had this boom and this bust in new call creation. Well, what kind of caused this? And how did these calls get known and spread around? And Don's already mentioned traveling callers. And I started dancing continuously. I mean, I started in 68, but I really didn't know anything until I restarted again in 74. So I came in at the beginning of going to the peak and rode the new call wave down. Traveling callers, certainly we would hit traveling callers at many of the dances we went to, and they would teach a new call. But I think Caller Lab's influence can't be understated. And here's some history of Caller Lab. It was organized, started in 71. They held their first convention in 1974. And one of the strong, this is a quote from Jack Lazary, I believe, one of the strongest challenges facing this new organization was to stem the flood of new calls that had brought frustration to dancers and callers alike. So let's just go back and look at this and see where 71 and 74 were on here. So here's 1971 and 74. So we'd already ridden the curve up a little bit, but it still had a bit more to go before it turned the corner. And the mainstream list instead of Bob Osgood's magazines was established in 1975 with an initial set of mainstream definitions soon after. And then that mainstream list changed every Color Lab convention until people got frustrated with the changing. And then they froze it for maybe 2 years and certainly 3 years and maybe even 4 years. It kind of alternated till we got on the more standard, let's update it every 3 years basis that we have now, except that we hardly ever make changes to it. The quarterly selection program was established in 1978. So even though we knew in 71 that we wanted to do something, it took until 78 before we really got a handle on what we were doing. And if we go back to our graph, that was like either the cause and effect was the quarterly selection program was established, which was 2 calls per quarter for mainstream, and later 2 calls per quarter for plus and advanced. And maybe that caused the downslide, or maybe the downslide was already happening. Or maybe just talking about it and acknowledging in a big public forum like Color Lab that we have a problem might have done it something. I also want to point out that color note services existed and created and propagated new calls and new ideas. So just some from my records, in the 1960s, there was a Les Gocher note service, and I couldn't tell, was that separate from Will Orlick, or did the two do it together, Don? Do you know?
Les Goucher, I was never, that was just slightly before my time. So when I was starting to get note service and such, Will did it alone.
Okay. And then Jay
They may have
King
been-
in 67, he was in Massachusetts. And Jack Lazary started one in 71, Bill Peters in 72. Earl and Al and Deuce had one in 75, and Bill Davis started one in 82. And there certainly have been more since then, and so forth. And each of these, like, they need material. And one idea for material is you'd look at the 20 new calls that came in the month or 2 months, depending on how often you published. And then you would give brief definitions of all of them, but you would feature the 1 or 2 that either you thought as a publisher were likely to become popular or you knew were already popular. Don can chime in if you want on any of this, or I'll move on.
Go ahead.
So this one looks like a call. I wanted to just show a piece of what it's like. Different people publish their calls different ways. This Don Beck guy, and I'm sorry I clipped the corner here. It was 1974.
If
Here's
you want,
Don's original notes.
if you want, Clark, I've got mine and I can put it up.
Yeah, I have it here. So here's the whole thing. 1974, Don Beck Ferris wheel. And this is using the notation he still uses today, and handwriting that we can read. And the call looks like what we know today.
Clark, if you scroll down 3 to the 4th page, I scanned it slightly differently so you can see the lines on the note paper, and it even looks more original there.
Yep.
No, go down to the next one, I guess. Right
there. You
there.
go.
And
Yeah.
you can see where the name got changed.
Oh, right. You put a piece of tape over it because you used to call it, what was it?
Shuffle and deal.
Shuffle and deal. Right.
That's a whole different story.
Yes. So there you have it. Oh, there you put it in again.
Oh,
So this is an example of somebody doing a really good job of a write-up and sending it in. If you were a note service publisher, like, this has a lot of information and stuff. But here's an interesting thing. Don had Ferris wheel working from lines facing in addition to other places. And as we adapted the call, that's not the usage, the application that got picked up. I mean, I think you knew at the time it wasn't going to be the popular one. It just was a curiosity. You made it fit in with wheel and deal could be done from lines facing in or out, etc. So why not Ferris wheel?
Can you pause on number 6 on the page that's just peeking out the bottom there?
Right here.
Yeah, because single circle to a
Star through, you would circle half and then star through because you had this great hand connection. And Don actually wrote that up as a call. So there's
Okay.
another call in our dictionary in Burleson called single circle to a star through.
That's okay. And then yeah, it was the Ferris wheel to the spin the top. So I'm trying to figure the ending formation here, or does it just not have the centers specifier on the spin the top?
Yeah, I think that unlike all the computer square dance programs where you'd have to say centers spin the top, I believe this is a center spinning the top, and the slide through ends with the center couples back to back, hence facing the outside people.
It's those who can, or the active ones are what do that. You can call single circle to a star through to any plus club right now and they'll dance it beautifully. I still like the call.
Yeah, well,
great.
Given that SSD has single circle, this is yeah, something I want to use now.
Because both hands are, the appropriate hands are engaged at the time. Guys drop their left, girls drop their right, and they make an arch with the others that are already joined.
Cool. Sorry to interrupt.
I was going to say something. Oh, you notice it says 1974. If you look at Color Lab lists, they'll say 1975. It took that long to become popular, enough so that Color Lab didn't know that it was originated before that.
Well, so that gets back to where did Color Lab get its stuff from? And let's just look up Ferris wheel for a sec. So here's my database of who wrote what calls when and all sorts of information about it. Sorry, it's such a small font. And here I have Ferris wheel is a Color Lab basic written in 1974 by Don Beck with a Burleson number, a page number in the Lee Cotman dictionary, 2 page numbers in the J. King dictionary, and a reference to the Bill Davis note service from 1978-08, and also something to tell a computer how to do a Ferris wheel. So I have it as 74. So usually Color Lab copied their dates from what I had because they didn't really have any other source, but I have it as 74. Maybe I corrected it or something.
By the way, the first note service that published it was Bill Peters.
I didn't subscribe to Bill Peters or have back copies of it. So I subscribed to it later, but so if we were being really good, someone would take this database and go back over all the old scanned caller note services and add references to all the different note services and all the times they reference the call. So you can look up choreography and see how it was first written up, etc.
Let me interrupt again or contribute. But what happened at the time was that if you came up with a new idea and you wanted to be a winner and have everybody use it, and it was kind of like the popular songs, lots of people created songs and some of them made the charts. What I found to do is you write it up as clearly as possible, then you send it to the editors of all the newsletters. Hopefully they will like it and publish it, and then the traveling callers will pick it up and it will become popular. And as a newsletter editor, which I became later, I found that just lots and lots of people, and I tried to publish the name, author, and a description of every call that I was aware of. And a lot of them were because people sent them in to me, and a lot of them were because I would go through Bill Davis's notes, because he did a pretty thorough job also, and he would read mine, and I would read his, and we'd try to get all the new stuff covered out there. And which Clark will get to later, the ones I chose to feature were ones that I deemed good, and I actually had a club that I would use the ones that I felt were worthwhile, and I tried 2 or 3, and then I'd write down what their reactions were to this, and if it was good enough, I would publish it. Go ahead, Clark.
So Don's covered these next 2 statements, that some calls were written up and sent in, and we know the date and author pretty accurately, and other calls were just invented and used and spread by word of mouth. And the various note service authors kind of were like, I'm hearing a lot about that. Do you know who wrote it? Do you know who wrote it? And maybe they'd write it up or not. The Bill Burleson dictionary, he was, I don't know if he was adamantly against, but he was against publishing authors' names, and he didn't have year written, because by doing that, you might be encouraging people to be inventing new calls. So it was mostly in his dictionary he wrote for dancers. So it was mostly communications among callers that would have that inside knowledge of who wrote it and when, et cetera.
He also didn't screen them very much, so there were frequently people would write the same call, the same movement half a year apart to a year apart, and give it a different name, and it would go in under Burleson's under a different name with us. In fact, an anecdote, I wrote a call once, I don't recall what it was, published it, sent it to all the note services, and before anybody really published it, I think John Sobalski wrote me an email, or probably not an email, I don't know if we had email back then, saying, nice call, Don, but Norm Poisson wrote it before and called it this. So there were 3 different references, and gave me Burleson numbers of the same movement, but different names. And ironically, all of a sudden it started to be used because my name was better than the others. But, I quickly wrote to the note services, scratch that. John Sobalski told me that this was not the case. And
your name wasn't better.
I'm sorry. Yes?
You said your name was better than the others.
The name of my call was better than the others. Yes. It wasn't my name.
Right.
It was the name of the others. Although when I saw new calls coming through, I've got to admit, when I was publishing, there are certain, if it was by certain authors, I would take a closer look at it, because certain authors had a good record and others didn't. But anyway, that's off subject so far. Go ahead, Glenn.
So certain dance groups were established who were really interested in new calls, sometimes by the callers, sometimes the dancers just wanted to dance all the new material. I don't know, Don, if you want to say anything about Don's Ponds here, but I've certainly danced at it and danced some of he always starts out and calls the new call, Try Your Luck, and then has a name if he likes it afterwards.
So when I was getting started, although I'd been calling for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, but I finally saw some dancers that danced at a better level than the local club that they and I danced at. And I said, gee, do you have more like you at home? I need a square to practice on. And I got a square together in my basement of decent dancers that I could practice calling with. And they said they had so much fun, let's do this again next month. And one of the guys said, or one of the couples said, and we have room for 2 squares in our basement. And so we met every month for 18 years. And it evolved into not only me practicing calling, because after 18 years I had a good handle on it, but it was my experimental workshop. I'd push them around. They named themselves Don's Pawns. And it was where I would use either some of the new calls that I wrote or some of the new calls people are sending in to me. And it was a place where I could workshop and experimentally play with what with what they were. Um, Clint, I just noticed a thing. We generally break into general discussion and after the semi-formal part of this. Let me know if you want, if it's pertinent here too. But so Don's Pawns, and when I was writing new calls, part of it was coming up with the action, and sometimes, you know, it was Monday afternoon at work and I had Don's Pawns that night, and I didn't have any new material, so I just make something up for them. You could do that sort of on the spot, or at least some of us could. And after you make up a new movement, then you had to come up with an appropriate name. And sometimes I couldn't come up with an appropriate name, but I wanted to see how the action was. So what Clark just mentioned, I called it Try Your Luck. And every month, Try Your Luck was a different call. And that group enjoyed just knowing this month when he says, try your luck, you do this. And that seemed to work out fine. Although I did have fun at one particular point. One month when I had a name for everything we were using, at some point in the middle, I called Try Your Luck, and everybody trusted me and knew, and they started moving ahead, and all of a sudden they stopped halfway through and said, you haven't taught us to try your luck this month. But it was just throwing some humor in there, and they all got a good laugh out of it. Anyway, was that?
Yep, that's good. I'll just point out that Bob Gamble in our area was, he ran a new calls workshop that is like 2 miles from where I currently live. We only went to it a couple times because it was far away from where I lived at the time. But it's funny that I live right near where we used to do all those new calls. So anyhow, why create new calls? Well, it might be you just want to be famous and get your name in print. Maybe it was fun. Maybe you needed to get in or out of a new formation as these galaxies and hourglasses and other crazy places were being invented. You wanted a call that got you in, or a couple, and you wanted a couple of calls that got you out. And often we'd struggle as those formations were created initially. Sometimes it gives you a new kinesthetic dance feel, and it just feels good to dance it, like the single circle to a star through. Even though you can call it directionally, if you give it a name, then it will get danced a lot more, and that's a good thing. We talked about the need for workshop material, and not only is it a workshop, it also, people think of workshops as floor equalizers, even though, in my opinion, that doesn't always work, because the better dancers pick it up quicker anyhow, and the struggling dancers are going to struggle with even more new stuff, but whatever. It's an outlet for various callers' creative juices. Some people feel the dancers are always in a learning mode and they want to learn more, so give them something more to learn rather than climbing up the levels.
Go US!
I don't know if you heard
I
that.
hear that.
US just scored 2-1 now.
Okay.
Let me interject something here as to why people write new calls. Again, speaking from a personal perspective, one of the calls I wrote on commission. This was, I went to a local workshop where Deuce Williams was calling. And Deuce was a very popular challenge caller and advanced caller at the time. He's written several calls. The only one that comes to mind right now is Follow Your Neighbor. But Deuce says, hey, Don, Earl Johnston, Al Brundage, and I are about to start a new newsletter, News and Notes, and we want to have a new call to feature that is an exclusive before the other note services get it. And what have you got? And I said, well, the latest I've got is nothing really good. I got something, but I don't think it's too good. He says, tell me what it is. And he said, and he told me, yeah, I agree, it's no good. And I said, well, I'll try and think of something. He said, you come up with a call that we can feature, and I'll give you a 1-year free subscription to the newsletter. So I was sitting, and I said, how long have I got? And he said, maybe 2 days. And I was sitting in my apartment and my magnetic dolls were on the refrigerator, and I had them into a quarter tag formation, which wasn't called that at the time, but that was a popular formation in some of the new calls. I'm trying to, I can't remember the name of, there was one that was fairly popular at the time. But just looking at that, all of a sudden I saw a circulate path, and then I tried to name it, and it looked like two players with a net down the middle. So I said, tennis circulate. And then I said, no, that's not a winner. So I came up with ping pong circulate. Told Deuce about it. He featured it in their first newsletter, and the rest is history. Just a little anecdote. Again, I got a free subscription for a year out of that one. But that's, again, not the typical reason people wrote calls. Like Clark said, it's there for a bunch of other reasons. But continue, Clark.
Yep, someone being bored, the caller or the dancer with the same old, same old. And Lee Kopman, a famous challenge caller who wrote a lot of calls, including ones we use at Mainstream and Plus, needed material for his challenge groups. And he had this creative mind, and he was always writing calls. And since he called for challenge groups and his dances were tape recorded, this would be on reel-to-reel audio tapes in the 60s and 70s. And then those were mailed to maybe 30 other basement challenge groups around the country and later the world. They would all have to learn and dance his calls. So he had a publication mechanism kind of built in to how his piece of the activity worked. And some of the questions you may ask about new calls is, why not just use directional calling, like single circle to a star through? Or for AC-doocy, why can't we just say end circulate centers trade? And I will say that you can directionally call a bunch of calls, but there's times when giving it a name and having its dance actions smooth out or get a automatic kinesthetic response makes it a better move and gets it used more. Who wrote some of our calls? Well, Lee Kopman, I have in my list. I got interested in all these calls back when I first heard of Burleson and bought a Burleson, and then got some other dictionaries. J. King published the names of authors in his dictionary, so I typed all that into my database. And then as I got other note services, Don suggested I subscribe to the Bill Davis note service and the Bill Peters note service. I started typing all that in, etc. And my database has 299 calls for Lee Kopman. I listed the ones that are used at Mainstream and Plus. So where would we be without Scoot Back?
No.
That didn't sound positive.
Probably wasn't. She's got headphones on, so she doesn't hear us, so we don't hear the game in the background.
That's pretty funny. So anything in roll, cut the diamond, coordinate, chase right, and recycle. Recycle, as many of you may know, is based on a larger call he first wrote done from a quarter tag formation called All 8 Recycle. And it ends up that two pieces of that could be broken into their own 4-dancer call. And that's why we have the 4-dancer ocean wave recycle that we all know, and the 4-dancer facing couple recycle. And there's many, many more that are in use today at the various advanced and challenge programs. Our own presenter here, Don, I have him listed for 35 different calls, and biggies that we use today at, say, Mainstream and Plus include Ferris wheel, ping pong, circulate, and chain down the line. I also mentioned another guy. I was fascinated. Don and I talked about him. I don't personally know Gus Green, but the name kept popping up over and over again as I was creating my database, but none of the calls were calls I'd ever heard of. So here was a guy.
I think Gus Green was from Western New York State.
Yeah, I was going to say from New York, in New York State, busy creating these calls. I don't know if he's a caller, a dancer, how much they got used. Did they spread? They certainly didn't come into my area, which was mostly challenged at the time. And yet early on, he hit on a winner, Zoom. And if any of you know Substitute, Substitute and Zoom kind of can be used interchangeably. And yet, and we had Substitute on the list. I'm sure it was in the basic 50 or extended 75. But once Zoom came out, it slowly drove out Substitute. And now we use Zoom, and Substitute's off all of our lists. Even like, I don't think we use it even up through C4.
Let me interject here, Clark. First of all, Joe Ubelacher wrote in the chat that Gus was from near Syracuse.
Okay.
And quite a drill instructor and caller.
Interesting.
And you said early on he came up with Zoom. Actually, he had come up with all sorts of very intricate type of calls for a long time. And Zoom, the simplicity of it came up much later. And I was convinced at the time, and I have nothing to change my opinion now, but he came up with it at the beginning of the summer when not much activity was happening. And so people picked up Zoom because there was nothing else around. I don't think because it was a call people acknowledged as being nice at the time. It was just the only thing that was out there at the time. Go ahead.
And I'm almost done, and we're running out of our half-hour suggested time slot. But since Deuce Williams was mentioned, again, excuse the small font here. But I'm going to quickly, I'm just searching for Deuce Williams. Crisscross the Deucey, we currently use at C3. Do It, I might talk about later. Diamond Chain Through, we use at advanced. That's one of his. Fan the Top in 1967 is a biggie of Deuce's, but not Fan the Web. Flip the Diamond, used at Plus in 1973 is Deuce's. Follow Your Neighbor from 1968 is on our Plus list from Deuce. Hourglass Circulate on the A2 list in 1973 from Deuce and Mac Parker, along with hourglasses in general. Stroll and Cycle was a popular experimental, probably in the 78, 79 timeframe. Touch a Quarter, 1976, along with Touch a Half and Touch Three. Oh, I lied. Never mind. That was Touch a Quarter Through. That didn't make it. We had Transfer the Column, Transfer and Anything I have credited to him in 75. And that's it. So Deuce gave us a bunch of calls on our current, that we currently dance, mainstream, plus, and maybe advanced. So that's pretty important. So I wrote down a bunch of questions that we aren't going to answer, although we could discuss in the discussion part. And like, when does an idea deserve to be a call? And are there existing unused calls that, they have names, they've been written, and they're good and fun to dance, but we currently don't have them as part of our dance program? The answer to that, I think, is definitely yes. How do I create a new call? Let's say I have an idea. Don's touched on it a little bit, but Don and I both believe this could be the topic of another whole session. Why don't we see any new calls today? I don't know if we have a good answer for that, but that would be good to ruminate about as we go on. How do we know a dance action doesn't have two or more names? Don mentioned on that before. And usually the way you do it is you ask someone really knowledgeable who's usually like a challenge dancer,
I
do you
used to
have a
ask
movement
Clark.
like this?
I used to ask Clark.
Yeah, ask me, ask Sobalski. And if it can be called directionally, does it need a name? I've spoken to that a little bit. So kind of to end, although I have one more thing I want to show at the bottom, which I hope doesn't derail the rest of the discussion, is like, we hope this talk gave you something to think about and that we have some good further discussion on it. Any other closing words you want to give, Don?
I have a couple of screens I want to show.
Good.
We don't have to dwell on them, but
Yeah,
and as far as AC/DC, to my knowledge, it was written before Circulate was.
that's correct. There's a whole history that we can go into on Circulate and the gambling named calls.
So can you stop sharing so I can just show a couple of things? One of the things is, just for laughs, I have slowly been going through a lot of my, let's see if I can read where it is. See if this is the one. I've been going. Are you seeing this thing? This is NCI Originals
Yes.
up here. Yeah, I've been going through a lot of my notes, and like Ferris wheel has been scanned in, so have a lot of the others I've talked about. And I've only gotten through some, but here's a quick list of mine. Some were published, some weren't. They have notes on the back of the 3x5 cards as to whether they were interesting or whether Don Spawns liked them or not. I also went through, let's see, this one here. I also, and let me bring it up forward, went through Clark's database, which I've had for a while. Thing is, probably a year ago, I tried to find a list of the quarterly selections on Color Lab base, the history of the Color Lab selection. Whoops, I'm looking at the wrong one. History of the Color Lab quarterly selections. And I couldn't find it. And then I looked on the, what's his name? the database that Barry Clasford is putting together. And he said there's nothing here. So I grabbed Clark's thing and I was going to try and get information off of it. I did a rough thing of it here, so don't count on this. But these are all the quarterly selections in the programs. And this is name of the call, program, author, and sorted by mainstream. And I think some of them may not have been mainstream. You just had QS on the list. The plus quarterlies, and then the advanced quarterlies. And to me, it was kind of interesting that some of the names here were people that I've gotten to know better than when they'd created those. And so here's that same list sorted by author that I thought might be of interest for people to look at. And I'll just scroll through it very slowly, and then we can go on with the question and answer part here. But just so you get a rough idea, some of those names should look familiar. And let me stop sharing. Unless there are any comments about this or questions? No, good.
Okay, let me do one more thing and then we'll start. I was able to read the comments while you were showing that.
Good.
And I want to, someone brought up, did our rise and fall of new calls match the rise and fall of interest in square dancing? And I created this and I've been looking for an opportunity to present it. So this is a proxy for popularity of square dancing as measured by attendance at the National Square Dance Convention. And we know there's a lot of reasons why the National Square Dance Convention is not the best measure of how is square dancing doing in the United States or the world. But it is something we have data for. It moves around the country, and that has issues. And if you think back in the earlier days, in the 50s and 60s, getting around the country was harder, like driving versus flying, for example. So keep that in mind. But what I notice, and a thing to get in your head, I think, and maybe this matches our experience of how square dancing is doing, is we had about a 10-year period from 57 to 67, the early days, where we were relatively flat in the attendance at the convention. So I bet square dancing was doing its thing, maybe growing, maybe not. But then we had this 10-year growth period and a 20-year plateau, kind of the good times. And Color Lab started in around 73 here. Okay. And then I don't know what this huge decline here was, but then we went in like a 15-year slow decline. We knew we were having trouble. We didn't quite know what to do about it, and we'd talk, and then it bottomed out with about 10 years of flatness in attendance. So I would like to have similar statistics for example, the New England Convention or other things that would kind of give us a proxy, because no one takes attendance of how many square dancers are there at each dance each night that's happening around the world. But I thought this was great to have this data. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we should let Clint go first because he had asked for a couple of minutes to speak on some stuff.
You're muted, Clint. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Well, thank you both. I'm in awe on both of you. You both are terrific. Don, I never realized you made all those calls. And Clark, what an organizational guy you are. I wanted to say that I'm Kip Garvey, and had a thing with Bob Brundage where Bob interviewed him on his life, and Kip said that he was ineffective as a caller for growth. And I'm teaching a class this year. I taught a class last year, and last year I was teaching calls, and I was teaching the calls, and I started between the club dancers and the class. I started with 4 squares, and I ended up with 6 couples. This year, I'm entertaining them, and I'm dancing them every week from the beginning. And I've kept 4 squares, and I've got 17 new dancers. I'm just saying what the callers did years ago. They entertained those people for a dance, and you just got to keep it as a dance as opposed to just the calls. Now, I learned from Earl Johnston, and he would talk about circle hash. He'd talk about four round one or chicken plucker. And it's a change in mentality that we should be dancing these people as opposed to teaching the calls. And so anyway, I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I think that's the trick. In the old days, we were entertaining the people every night, maybe trying to trick them up a little bit every now and then. And I was really into all the new calls. I mean, that's what it was about. You know, you have Dick Ledger that kept moving people, and I thought Dick Ledger was an old fogey in my teenage stupid stuff. You know, dumbass McLean. What can I tell you? And now you look at Dick Ledger and you listen to his songs and what heck, he could play guitar and call at the same time. So anyway, I'm not going to take a lot of time, but it's a different emphasis if we want to create growth. And thank you for listening.
I want to mention that Clint is I think this is the first one of these sessions you've joined us on, Clint. But when I was trying to become popular in the New England area, Clint was a young teenager, but boy was he popular, and boy was he good, as was his brother, his younger brother. Clint and I went to one caller school. Just to give you some perspective of the times, the main two instructors were Earl Johnson and Frank Lane, and the rest of the staff included Burl Main, Jerry Haig, and I forgot who the third one was, equally popular. And some of the students, aside from Clint, Elmer Sheffield was one of the students there too. Good old days is what it's all about, and it's great to reconnect with Clint because we were, as well as fellow callers in the area, good friends. It's close enough to the hour that I think I'm going to make the typical closing chat comments, and then we'll continue. But thank you guys for coming. I'm glad to see that we have as nice a turnout as we've had in quite a while. I'm hoping the intermittent thing continues to work okay. I have several other ideas of people I have to contact. I do feel good. I don't have the pressure of having to do it every week. I see we have Sweden, Germany, Canada, US, Australia. Did I miss any here? I don't think so. Or is Texas a separate state? Anyway, sorry, Stephen. I want to thank you guys all for coming. I want to thank the other presenter for Clark and I did this presentation, and I think a lot of his prepared stuff was we did it at Caller Lab, something similar, of course, different side stories back in, what was the date on the top of that? 2006, 2011, I don't recall. But it's fun to reminisce some of this stuff, and I think it maybe helps some of you guys understand what's going on too. And I think the discussion could be interesting if we kept going with it. So thank you, Clark, etc. And as I usually say, if you only schedule an hour for this, don't make excuses, just slither away. And if you want to stay around and discuss some more, let's be discussing. All right, and I'll try to look for where the hand's up. And Joe Ubelacker's hand is up. Go for it, Joe.
Go figure. I always have something to say, I guess. Just a couple of quick things. One is, Clint, I haven't seen you in probably 50 years. I remember Clint, the first dance I danced to Clint, he came off the stage as soon as he saw me, he came down and he says, "How am I doing?" And I thought, yeah, don't ask me that. I'm here to dance. Anyhow, that was always great fun there that way. Clark, along with that slide on the peak of when the most dancers were at the different conventions, might be good to parallel that with the economy of the times and see what happens. Because maybe in 95 or so, there was a big economic turndown. There were several of them, and that might influence our attendance to some extent.
Certainly 74, I think we had the gas shortage.
Okay. On new calls, I think we'll still get new calls, just not on as much of a basis as we used to. For instance, you have Carl Hanks had written Spin Chain and Exchange the Gears. Well, prior to that, we had Exchange the Diamonds at the challenge level. And so this was a great extension of that. That was kind of nice. Myself, I wrote calls to help other call action. At the time, we did cross trail through, and everybody seemed to always go to the corner. And that was not the definition. There was trail through, there was all kinds of trail calls that confused the issue. So I wrote a call where from lines of four, you would cross trail through centers, trade, and roll. I don't remember what the ends did, but it emphasized the cross trail through as being a pass through and a half sachet thing. And because everybody kind of went different directions, I call it wander yonder. I always try to make it the name effective. At the challenge level, I wanted something from facing couples where you could quickly get into a box or a column. So I invented shortcut because it was a really short maneuver, which was kind of neat. For cast off 3/4, a lot of people didn't like to push cast, so I wrote a call where it took from a quarter tag, people facing doing a pass through, and that was kind of a new concept or a new idea. But then there was a cast off 3/4 that you had to know how to do, and so I had no idea what to call it. So I call it make a pass, and I would tell the dancers, you can do this call even if you don't do what I tell you, which was okay. Deuce Williams caught me up on the call touch and go because it was from a column. He said, but we're already touched. Ross Howell came along with something, I think it was stimulate, that superseded my touch and go, which was a better call. And the last thing I tried to do is, because so many dancers will get cattywampus to the hall, I tried to develop a call that would put people on an oblique angle on purpose. Obviously, it's like Victor Borghi's crossing a potato with a sponge. It had a lot of gravy, but it didn't taste good. The concept was great, but nobody liked it. So anyhow, that's my thoughts.
Daryl, before you join in, let me mention a couple things. First of all, Joe, are you familiar with my tilt the wave? That did that.
I remember, yeah.
Gave you, and mostly it was, never mind the reasons behind it, but so some people, and Clark and I have talked about this, think that square dancing would be better off now if we did introduce a new call just to play around with, to level the field. And I came up with the term disposable experimental many years ago, thinking, use it tonight. The main thing to remember about it is to forget it the second you walk out the door. And Clark's website includes several calls that he likes that would make good disposable experimentals. So if anybody needs that kind of stuff, go check there. I think Tilt the Wave is probably on there too. But Daryl, tell us what you got to say.
What I have to say, very, very nice, you two. You did a good job. To me, my recollection, of course, not having been around too long, I started dancing in the mid 60s and started calling in the late 60s. Back when it was very, very simple, it would be tremendously boring to anybody that's a mainstream dancer or beyond today. Tremendously boring because there weren't many things that we called. And we certainly didn't get into a whole lot of different applications. But that's just where it was at. Note services were the reason that, part of the reason that I wanted to get my name out there as a caller. So I could write calls, put them in. Don and I met through note service of Jay King back in those early days. But just for the history of this thing, in my mind anyway, we went from an activity that could be taught very quickly to anybody with half intelligence, and started kicking these new movements out, which some became popular, some didn't, but there were. I had note services from practically everybody: Bill Davis, Bill Peters, Jay King. I took them all, and I took them to my club dance. Well, started to go from that very, very simple to having to expect something new along the way. Every dance that I did, I was going to have something different, and I had workshops for the same. Color Lab came along, said we need to stop this flood of new movements. So they stabilized the list for basic and mainstream. Good job. And quarterly selections were going to stop the flood of new movements, which they did. But at the same time, they killed all of the creativity, which was being distributed through the note services. So we didn't have the new movements coming in. I don't say that's a good or a bad thing. I'm saying that's the way that it worked. And if you look at the timeline, I think you're going to see that. And that I think is that flattening out period of there. We started getting these quarterly selections, and some of the groups around the country wouldn't let go of them. They were supposed to do them for that 3-month period and then drop them. But my dancers like them. And if I don't call them, Don Beck across the street is going to. So the thing started going like this. And College Lab said, no, that's not what we had in mind. So instead of doing that, let's create a new program and we'll call it Plus. Guess what? That very, very simple, easy to learn, and based more on entertainment than choreography that we had in the 60s started getting very difficult because we had Plus. Did we stop it then? No. We kept collecting those movements, and we had +1 and +2. So we didn't go from here to here, went from here to here. And through the years, folks, that collection of calls said, we've got to put a stop to that. We did. What do we replace it with? Extended applications. So we didn't have a new movement. We didn't have anything. We've factionalized the activity into a basic mainstream +1, +2, A1, A2, like that. And things were going like this. And that's the history of the thing right there. And it's turned into more of what you call than how you call. Extended applications has taken over on this thing. And what happens with the club level, your new people coming in, they have to go into that type of an environment. And I've challenged everybody for the last 15 years at least to go to your club. All of the clubs in Oregon, and I think most of the country, require insurance for their dancers. Now, maybe they don't all, but I think probably most all of them do. And you can go back through the history of the clubs and see where they got fairly nice classes, and the people in the class lasted clear through there, and they graduated and they joined the clubs, and several months later, they're all gone. That's because of the environment that we created that demands them know more than what they get in those initial lessons. And we just drive them out the door. No, I blame the callers, naturally. I don't think it's the economy. I think it's just a matter of being too darn hard and the concentration being on choreography rather than fun and games and being entertained from the stage. So now that sounds very negative. I'm so sorry about that, but I think that's probably what happened. Now there was one more thing. There was a time back in the 60s, the late 60s particularly, when we had clubs, brand new clubs springing up everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And I think that continued up until probably the early 70s anyway. And then it just kind of petered out. And there's probably a choreographic reason for that as well. So, food for thought. That's all that is. With all that, I've taken too much of your time. I'll shut up. But thank you.
Let me say a couple things before we get on to Mickey.
Um,
I added a new graph to the screen, and the blue line is what you've seen before, which is attendance at the national convention. But the orange line is attendance at the National Challenge Convention, which later turned into the National Advanced and Challenge Convention. And this is a convention that started in 1967. So way before I started dancing, and in the 60s, which could in some ways be some of the heyday of square dancing. And it started because the National Square Dance Convention didn't allow there to be a hall where people did that kind of dancing. So they started their own convention after trying for several years to convince the National Convention to do something. And it went along at its particular level. It's measured in squares on the right side. And then it opened up a second hall and a third hall and a fourth hall and added advanced and a fifth hall. So now at the peak, it's dancing 5 different halls as in all the plateaued things, as Daryl points out, where we divide the dancers up into little groups and they each do their thing. And as I just eyeball this, I can see an up and a down. And, however many years later this is, 85 versus 76. So 10 years later, Advanced and Challenge had the same rise and fall. Just pointing that out as data. Okay, Mickey?
Before Mickey goes, I have a couple of more administrative things. Actually, a question on that chart, Clark, was that vertical axis for the challenge and the national the same? So
No, the axis on the left was dancers at the national. The axis on the right was squares at the challenge convention.
Okay. I couldn't see that
Yes.
when I was looking. The other thing I wanted to mention that I should have before, that because we're intermittent, when we do have these things, I will be posting them on various Facebook groups as I have in the past, but also I do now have a mailing list of people that want to be notified. If you want to be added to that mailing list and you're not on it already, just send your name and email address, which will come automatically with it, and tell me you want to be put on that mailing list, and send it to Don Beck at donbeck.org. And another couple of quick, this is a personal anecdote, but Clark, you were talking about that first chart where all of a sudden there was a steep drop off.
Yes.
I figured out what that was. That's the year that I moved to the island and went from calling 4 or 5 nights a week to 3 or 4 times a year. So it must have had something to do with my influence, right? And Daryl, you were talking about all the various applications that we've added over the years. This is an anecdote that I've heard from way before my time, but I think it's pertinent for the conversation that we've had. I don't recall who it was that wrote Swing Through, but I think his original intention was from an ocean wave, ends an adjacent centers trade, and then centers trade. And because nobody was working with left-handed waves, but just right-handed waves, people would say trade by the right, trade by the left, or swing right, swing left. And eventually that's the part that got written down in the definitions, a right then a left. If anybody knows, can confirm that or deny that, I'd like to hear that. But that's because at the time they didn't have the left-handed wave. Even though the intention was otherwise, it wasn't written down the way the author had intended it.
Don, author is Dale Coleman, Coolman, in 1962.
1962. Interesting. Okay. Mickey, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I know exactly how the lady in the background of your home feels since Germany's been out. So, yeah. Personal anecdote talking about new calls or writing calls. I've once in a while been asked to come up with a call regarding to special dances, which I wrote special calls and which were used at a dance and workshop. And dancers had a lot of fun. But the most recent one I have is for my club, the Munich roller coasters. They said when they were invented, said, now we want our own call. And so I thought about, and I came up with a call, which is very entertaining and guests like it. I only do call it at the roller coasters, but I've written it down. And so I maybe make it public to others because guests which have been there really enjoyed it very much. And it's the roller coaster ride. So the name is Roller Coaster Ride. And it more or less is imitating a roller coaster ride with the choreo. So what I usually start up with the square through, which brings them very slowly up to the corner box, and then we have a right and left through. And then taking a look at the roller coaster ride is when you build it up, you're going up the hill, and then you come around the corner. This is the right and left through. Now the down going is the roller coaster ride. Now the important thing is that the center dancers are the tracks, so they always keep where they are more or less, but moving forward and backward. And those on the outside gonna dive in, which is the roller coaster, which is taking a right, and it's taking a right all the way through. So the first action is a dive through, and then you veer to the left, and then to the right, and then you dive out, and then you wheel around, and because those with the arch have made you again can dive in again. And then important, it's a veer right this time, and then veer to the left. And then you have a zero box, and you can use that in a singing call. And it's a little bit based, I would say, like on a dip and dive type thing, but it really creates excitement. And of course, when they dive under, it's just like Scream, like in real life. And those veer left, veer right, those actions are going out. It's just like those hard hits you get in a roller coaster, those sharp turns or whatever. And I have done that a couple of times in a couple of years in Houston, and I was in a park and was watching the Blue Fire in the Euro Park, and there was a looping there. And I thought that'd be cool if I could get something in there now too. And so I extended it to a roller coaster loop. And it's while you dive in, and in the center where you do the veer left and veer right action, when you do that, you add to that 2 wheel arounds or reverse wheel arounds. And that's incredible. They just go hilarious about it. So I want to try, I can bring up the definition in the right, but it's really, really simulating that roller coaster ride or even the loop, right? And it flows nice. You can put it in there in the singing call, and yeah, that's just from my side. It's fun for the dancers, but I think I would not like to see it in the program also.
Creativity is not dead. Yay.
Yeah.
Daryl, you got your hand up again.
I do. A couple of different things here. Clark, I wonder about the comparison in overall dancer population as your chart there, as it compared between the challenge and the challenge convention and mainstream convention, whatever. But I think they probably compare to each other. So when the trickle down or trickle up, it would be the challenge. I think it's the same. Something else that occurred to me just as the discussion was going on here, talking about history again. If I think back, the 70s, early 70s were pretty much when the resort part started to become a thing. Now, the top callers sorry about that, but the really big names, they all wanted to get in a park because they could stay in one place all winter long and call to these huge crowds of dancers. So that took them out of the picture for a good percentage of the year as far as traveling goes. So that had I think probably more of an effect on the activity than a lot of other things, because in the parks you're calling 5, 6 days and nights a week, and you've got other people around. You're not going to put in a lot of new movements, so that's going to slow down the number of new movements. And you have to have something to call because you have a class in the morning, you have a workshop in the afternoon, and a dance at night. Extended applications were an easy way to do that. Now, these same callers headed out on the road during the summertime, and they didn't have all these new movements. And we still had to, I say we, sorry about that, but they still had to have something a little different to call to set themselves apart from the local callers that they were calling to on their way through. So they would do an extended application or the occasional new movement, but not like it was before that. So that's probably a good percentage of the why we got to where we were. We didn't control it. I don't know that there's any real control of it now, but I think SSD, the concept behind it is right. I hope it works. With that, I think Brian's got something to say.
Go for it, Brian.
Okay. So as far as I guess people creating new calls and a drop off of that stuff, like when I was a younger, newer caller, I was pretty keen, and I wrote a bunch of calls, probably about 30, I think. But I had run them past my mentor at the time, Dave Stevens, and every time he'd look at me and go, "Oh yeah, well that call's already on the C3 list," or "Oh, that call's already on this list," and "Oh, that call's on this list." And nowadays, like if I write something, because Dave isn't alive anymore, I just shoot it at either uh, who else do I shoot to? Debbie Cedar or Rob French, and they usually have the same answer, and it's usually, "Oh well, that call already exists." So it's pretty discouraging creating new calls these days, mostly because there's so many calls out there. It's hard to find one that is unique. So yeah, that's probably one of the reasons why they're not making a bunch of new calls these days. And the fact is there really isn't a pretty big need for it. And then the other thing that I have to mention about this was the last time I recall Lee Kopman making a brand new call. He was actually here in Vancouver. He and his son, Steve, were going on a cruise to Alaska, and they borrowed my equipment for the cruise. And so at the end of the cruise, Steve was all excited. He came off the ship and handed me my equipment, and he goes, "Oh yeah, Dad wrote a new call." And I go, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, it's called Go Cruising, and it starts like a load the boat, and it finishes like this and that." And he was all excited, and I said, "Oh, well, imagine if you took that call and you started it like a Go Cruising, but you finished it like a tally ho, and we'd call it Go Cruising for a Ho." And Steve thought it was hilarious, and Lee wasn't very impressed by that name. he didn't like it very much at all. But yeah, and that's the nice part about Lee, was he was able to make something new, and it didn't match anything. And being that he had a knowledge of almost all the calls that were written, he knew what wasn't out there. So that's the other thing that's difficult for somebody writing new calls, is you don't know what else is out there. So it's
quick anecdote relative to that. Sorry, Clark.
no problem.
No, I meant the other Clark that's got his hand up.
No problem.
I was talking to Steve Kottman about a year ago, trying to get him to do one of these sessions. And he told me about when he was a kid driving with his dad would say, "If I went from here to here, what would the formation be? If I went from there to here, what would the formation be? Now, give me one call to resolve. And when I couldn't come up, this, I'm quoting Steve probably incorrectly, but the idea is there. Because when I couldn't come up with a call to get from here to there, he'd write one for me. So that's where Steve says all the new calls came from. Clark Baker, you have your hand up.
So I was thinking that perhaps one of the reasons new calls decreased is what maybe someone thought was going to happen in the patent office and never did, is that everything's already been invented. I do think it's harder to write new calls that we don't have a similar motion, or maybe with advanced or challenged terminology already have a way of calling it. The main point I wanted to make, and this came up as I was chatting with Michael Maltonfort, who's a caller in Chicago area, and used to be my definitions co-chair. We were talking about, I was preparing for this talk and the rise and fall of square dancing and all that. And he said that his epiphany from a while ago is perhaps square dancing is just a fad. And I said, you mean a fad like hula hoops and silly putty? And he goes, yeah. And fads don't have to come and go in a 1 year period, and pet rocks, or a 5 year period. We had our burst in the 60s and 70s, and it was a wider burst than a typical fad. And we've been slowly trailing down, and we have the hangers on and the people who are interested. But I think there's a lot to that. So I'll put that out there just as a, maybe this is just a fad and we're at the tail end of it.
Yeah, you forgot to mention Rubik's Cubes.
And Rubik's Cubes, and they're still out there and in the culture.
Which you introduced me to. I think I still have the original one that you imported.
Let me steal one more thing while we're here. And I'm going to do it by stealing the screen. And this will give you guys something fun to play with. But, and you don't know whether, ooh, good, we got a couple of hands up. I won't try not to take too long with this. If I go to here, you can go to, if you just remember this word, Google Ngram. So as you're probably aware, Google has tried to scan basically all the books in the world, or at least all the old books in the world. And that means almost everything ever written is in Google. And you can search for stuff, and the N in Ngram means you can search for phrases up to 5 words long. So let's just look in all the books in history up till 2019. What do you want, square dance or square dancing? Now, why would the word square dance exist in writing? Are we able to see the results? Does it cut off on your pictures here, or can you see it all the way out?
I see it all the way out.
Good.
We can
Okay,
see
it's
it.
cut off for me, but I'll leave it like it is. So from 1800 in English books up till 2019, this is what percentage of the phrases are the word square dance. Now, it's a small percentage. I don't care about the absolute number, but you can see, you know, square dancing kind of came as a term into writing in the 1870s, 1880s. It peaked way up in 1952. It went down to 68. It came back up into 1982 for reasons we might talk about. And then it's slowly been kind of going down. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that's how prevalent square dancing is or anything. I can do a comma and write square dancing. And you can see that sometimes the phrase in the book is square dance and sometimes it's square dancing. And And you can try other ones. Maybe hoedown. Maybe barn dance.
Oh, down is way down.
Yeah. And, you know, barn dance,
Pattern
they had
dancing.
barn dances in the 40s, but then I think it got replaced by the phrase square dance. So I found this to be fascinating and spent more time playing with it than I should have when I should have been preparing for the talk today. And just because it's in written books and published, like that's a long after effect of square dancing, of us teaching lessons and having people go to a square dance, etc. Now, here's a weird one. Oops. Is that going to do it for me? No. It ends up that China has, they call square dancing something else. And it's been written in American books, but it always has some Chinese translation next to it. So there is a peak of recent Chinese square dance stuff. Oh, I know where I need to do this. This will, if we go, I found it. The other one to look at is Google Trends. Remember that term and search for it. I can search square dance. This is what people search for. So here's square dancing. You can see it's kind of been on a decline since 2004, or square dance lessons. You know, do people search for square dance lessons? Not too often. But I think this was where I got Chinese. Yeah, not coughing up what I discovered last night. Can't go back there. But anyhow, those two tools, the Ngram viewer and and the Google Trends, can give you lots of good stuff. I will stop here and turn it over to Larry.
I'm going to interject and take my my position where I can interject because I feel like it. But Clark was mentioning way back when, and Larry, and then my Nikki. Clark was mentioning way back that one of the reasons people wrote calls is to become famous, so their name will be here. And I wrote a call that it still hasn't made me famous, and I can't understand why people didn't use it. I wrote it because of a conversation that Daryl and I had at Caller Lab many years ago. And I'm really happy to say that Hannah Tannenbaum, within the last year, I guess, used that call as the middle break of a nice recording she did on Rhythm Records. So I may get famous yet, but go ahead, Larry. Oh, by the way, it's called Grand Tour. If you look on YouTube, you can see Dick Ledger calling a double grand tour, although he doesn't call it that. But it's out there. And the only time I ever danced it was at a traditional dance when Tony Parks used it. Larry, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, so on the subject of old calls that are not current calls, I've grabbed a few of them and just turned them into directional calls with some of my programs. And the dancers never know that they used to be calls. They're just, you know, flowing choreography. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing I wanted to mention is I started calling in 1970. And so I called throughout the entire 70s. And I was a young caller, young dancer during that time. And in 1976, as many of you have heard and know, you know, we had a gigantic national convention. And all the conventions thereafter, you know, were really dramatically smaller. And this created a certain attitude among the dancers that something was wrong with square dancing. And so I heard this all the time, 77, 78, 79, square dancing is losing dancers. We have to do something. The square dancing is dying. Anytime a dancer was interviewed by a newspaper, they would say, we love our activity, but we're losing dance. They gave this negative view. At the same time, at Color Lab, there was much concern about this as well, and so various callers were pointing to different things, and the new calls were probably one of the most common things that callers would point to, and they would say, well, this is the cause. But from my point of view, I wasn't writing calls. I was a regional caller, and dancers were having a great time. But I just saw this negative attitude creeping into the activity, both from callers and from dancers. And I heard it over and over and over and over. And remarkably, I got out of square dancing in 1992. To be honest with you, I was personally convinced that the program was done when I got out of it. I returned in 2016, and I was delighted to see the activity was still there. But I heard the same negativity. All the dancers ever wanted to talk about was how great square dancing used to be. Square dancing used to be this, used to be that. Our dancers, we used to have so many dancers. We used to have so many squares. Like there was something wrong with the activity. And my thought was, hey, we're having a great time. We're having a fun time. Who cares, what we did in the past? Let's just have a great time. Let's have a great dance. But I see that same attitude, and I've always been concerned, even from the 70s, that was going to actually be the undoing of our activity. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, the concept of having fun just dancing is an interesting one. Nick, and your perspective of now and then is good, is interesting when it fits in different places. Mickey, what do you got to say?
Yeah, it's interesting what Larry just said, just to step on that as well. And I think there is some truth to it, and I think we need to bring out more positive transfer. And if talking that way among each other, it's almost like that we're punishing the people being there and saying you're not worth it. It has been better. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think we should team up as a team. And even if we lose the World Cup or get knocked out, and try to stand up again and do the best out of it, and bring out the positive aspects we do have and the arguments. Yeah. So this is very, very valuable point Larry brought up here. I just wanted to add to that roller coaster ride, because some people asking for a definition. I will put it out and give it to Don so he can send it out with the definition. And the funny thing is, compared with real hexagons, usually when going into the center and passing through the center, you usually split up. If you do it the right way, you also can use that routine, that call, in a real hexagon and have the same outcome, and you will have another zero box. So that's the really, really fun part about it as well, that you can use it in a square as well as in a hexagon. And
send it to Dan instead of me. It'll get
propagated
better.
All right. And I think, if writing a call or whatever, I don't really want to bring everybody in writing calls, whatever, but since all the technical type things, I agree with what's been said before. There is nothing new you can invent. Like, it's just like in music. After Brahms, there is nothing new. It's all in there, but taking pictures, just like I did with the roller coaster ride, in the combination, that can be a fun part. And to me, dancing from the old outcome, what it was intended to be was to bring in all days lives into a musical motion, taking a definition of dancing. And I think we can put that in square dance as well, as an entertaining part, which I think is the most important thing to keep people and to attract new people.
I've decided that instead of intruding as an intruder, I'd raise my hand because I have a story that I think it was interesting, particularly if you're interested in writing new calls. This is something that an experiment I tried way, way back and really opened my eyes to something. It was back when Lee Kopman wrote Ah So, and you don't have to know what the calls are. Just listen to the story. I mean, the Ah So's on the C1 list, I believe, right now. And he wrote it just before going on a tour of Japan and wrote something that he thought he would use a Japanese word instead of an American word for the name. But anyway, when that came out, I looked at it and I said, you know, that's nothing but a single hinge split counter rotate, exact footsteps, exact action, exact what have you, when done from waves. And so when I went to Don's Pawns the following first Monday of the month, I guess I could take my hand down too. When I went to Don's Pawns, who basically knew A1, but they would play with any particular call, reactions, lower hand, there we go, would basically play with any particular call that I gave them. I taught them, they knew single hinge. I taught them split counter rotate a quarter. And then I proceeded for the next 2, 3, 4 tips just to use that combination of hinge and split counter rotate a quarter together. So they would sort of accept it as a single call, like lead right, circle to a line. And they were dancing that smoothly. And then the next tip, I totally dropped using that and taught them Ah So, which had the exact same footprints. And I used that for a tip or two. And then when they got to that, then I started interchanging Ah So with single hinge split counter rotate a quarter. Same call, they danced it differently. They really danced it differently. And that blew my mind. I thought it was extremely interesting, but it was just, sometimes you do need a call like AC Doocy instead of End Circulate Centers Trade, because they dance it differently. It was a surprising discovery for me. And I still don't understand why.
Yeah, it's just like on a linear cycle and calling it differently.
We were waving at Daryl, who was saying goodnight. Good
Oh,
morning.
okay.
What were the calls you just said, Michael? Nikki?
I said on a linear cycle, the same thing. If you have it in one motion called and split it up, it's even if it's the same footprints and everything, should work the same way. It looks different. It feels different. Yeah.
There's another anecdote similar where I didn't witness this, but I hear that Lee Kopman and Ron Schneider were talking, and Ron said to Lee, why do you need, I had the column, what's the call I'm thinking of, Clark? Pass and roll.
Oh, you could just say step to a wave.
Yeah,
scoot back
and
split
Ron
circulate.
said I can just call step 2 wave, scoot back and split circulate. Why do you need, who needs pass and roll? And Lee answered, I do. Because Lee needed new words. Oh, Brian, your hand's up. Good.
How are we all doing on lip reading?
Yeah, I hate it when that happens. One of the other things that I had to work on, or at least I wrote a call, and I thought it was a really cool idea until you start to realize that it was completely politically incorrect to use this call. And so I came up with a concept, and the concept was everybody work trans. And the idea there being that, well, you would do that call, every part of that call you would do as the opposite sex. and so it kind of made sense as a call, but it's still, you know, somewhat politically incorrect. So it wouldn't be something good to be using at a dance, although you could just tell the dancers to, you know, do everything, you know, with the next call as though you were the opposite sex.
In a group of people who are extremely sensitive to gender issues, I've heard that concept referred to as Denmark. I'm not quite sure why.
Wow. Okay. But yeah, it was, as I say, I thought it was very neat, but again, the funny part is it really only affects like very few calls, like, you know, slide through, courtesy turn, other, you know, other calls that are only sex related. So so it's not like it's going to get a lot of usage. Mostly it'll be, you know, changing slide through is probably the easiest one that I can see people using it for.
Another story that, you know, as a note service guy, trying to figure out what calls have potential and what ones don't. I think before I was in that position, I went to a dance once and a caller introduced a new call that he had written, and I thought, who needs that? It's such a simplistic thing. This was Jerry Helt, and he had introduced Sweep a Quarter. And to me, that was too simplistic. Little did I know that was a great call. Sweep a Quarter is one of the, well, I guess it's one of the very first introductions of a concept, or as Clark puts it, as a suffix call, but its action depends on the previous call. And again, the judgment on my part of that's a nothing, why did he do that, was way off base at the time. It's really hard to tell. Does anybody ever use Sweep a Quarter?
Don?
Yes.
I have a comment on aso.
Yes.
I don't think it's Japanese. I think it's Bavarian. And we have, if you tell somebody something and he doesn't quite understand and he's astonished, he says in Bavarian, he says, uh-huh, which is a kind of a question mark. And if he then understands why you explain, and he goes, so very often, if you explain something to callers or even dancers, they go, so in our area. And I say, no, that's a C1 call. So got to be careful when putting that on the microphone with the over here.
Actually, the Japanese aso means is that so? And it is a Japanese term, and it's been used around the world to pretty much mean that, but I believe it did originate in Japan, and he did name it that because he was going to Japan.
Right.
Yeah, there was a trend to name things with common, I can't think of them, but with common.
I'll mention them right now.
Tally ho.
Well,
No.
no, well, I mean, things like tally ho would be just a phrase that's in common usage, but they started naming calls after directional terms or common phrases certain callers said. For example, do it and nicely and take your time. So
a little more.
And a little more, right? And this actually got so egregious that dancers and callers were really complaining, and I think it even, you know, showed up in Color Lab discussions, etc. So, but they did stick with us. So we actually, I think we've dropped it now, but nicely exists. But you know, it was do it nicely and take your time. And you just say it in a way that sounds like you're just talking to the dancers, but you really meant for them to do it. So it existed for a short period of time as a little gimmick, but then it kind of fell out of favor.
Just like
The
a pass
dancers
through the
revolted,
K?
yeah.
Like a pass through the K?
Yeah.
I remember challenge dancers callers saying, be careful what you say.
Yeah.
Because they may dance it, right?
It's funny with the words like, from kind of magic. I know them like hocus pocus or
Hocus
Shazam,
pocus.
right?
Little known fact, somebody or what have you, somebody pointed out to me that it wasn't quite the only, but if you think about Ferris wheel, it's one of the few calls where the name is not a verb, but it's a noun. There are others, and there's a long story I'll try not to bore you with as to how it got named. But
By the way, do you receive any royalties from the Vienna Club with their Ferris wheel party?
I have been asked many times in years back, do you get a commission when somebody calls the call Ferris wheel? And my answer is, God, I'm glad I don't, because I'd have to pay so many commissions to other people for stuff I used. So
You hear me now, Clark?
I do hear you.
I was just saying that it's a good thing that fad did fall out of practice very
Yeah.
quickly. And it was all this, because at that point they would have started naming calls after callers unpleasantly. And it's a good thing the call also was already taken.
Yeah.
actually, Mel, I did write a call in jest. Those facing out did something, or those facing in, it was cop out or cop in. And when I wanted the men to do it, I'd say copman. That's why it didn't go over, because
Because Lee would keep saying he's talking to you, Steve.
yeah, no, I let that one go by. I don't think I ever published it, but I used it a little bit just for laughs. We seem to be getting to that time. Dan was about to say that, weren't you?
Well, I was going to provide some approbation first because I really enjoyed this session. This was, I think there was a lot of good history in this, and I've been having some discussions. Joyce and Jeff, and dang it, I'm blanking on her name, all say hi to Clark, because I've been dancing with driving them to Eric Hennerlau's Dance by Definition session, which is giving me a really good counter to some other discussions I've been having with local clubs about, we just want to dance simple stuff fast, and how do we do this? So yeah, you all have given me a good history lesson and some fantastic things to think about, and I really enjoyed this session. Thank you.
I'm impressed, Dan, that you enjoy history. When I had been calling as few years as you had, I could really care less.
I hated it. Yeah.
I really enjoy it these days, but
That's because you are it, Don.
I are it, yeah. Well, some parts of it I do remember in that respect. It's hard to think of having been calling for 58 years. That's maybe we'll have a party at 60 rather. A reminder, another thing that I should have mentioned is if you're interested in the videos of these sessions, I've created a playlist. Dan has a list that includes the videos and lots of other information. Thanks to, he's not here right now. Anyway, the Orange County Callers Association lists these plus Mel's plus other things. And Mel, do you want to do an advertisement for your thing? I guess what you have.
Got one coming up in about, what is it, 5 o'clock now? So 4 hours. But
yeah, with Chris Stacy.
Mickey, give us a big smile there, because he's one of the presenters for today.
Was Chris Stacy the other? Did I read that?
Both Mickey and Chris.
Good. I probably won't be there. I try to limit my time a little bit.
You're going to be drowning your sorrows over the last football game, are you?
Yeah, I guess.
Or shall I say the last soccer? In case I've been in Australia too long. Last soccer match.
And I noticed Joe's hand has come up.
Oh, glad you noticed that. Joe.
Yeah. I love those crazy names that we had for so long. and maybe someone else can give me better detail on it, but I think it was Keith Gully used to always end his tips with bottom of the corner, you're looking good. And I forget who he was calling with, Ross Howell or somebody, and they actually made up a movement for looking good. And the first time Keith Gully, this was at I think at one of the challenge conventions, and Keith does this, and he goes, "You're looking good," and the dancers all of a sudden do the call, and he's like, "Huh? What's going on?" Oh, and the other thing was, when we're talking about people who just want to dance, it happens at the challenge levels too. I went down to call for a C1 group along I think it was in Connecticut, one of Red Bates's groups, and the dancers came out to help me in with my equipment. And the one guy said to me, he says, "No," he says, "You know, we are a C1 club." And I thought, oh, gee, he's going to say they want it really tough. And he said, "Well, I said, "Oh, yeah, I know." He said, "Well, we're known as the most mainstream C1 club in New England. We're going to have fun." So,
Joe, I used to think of that there were two kinds of challenge callers. There were challenge callers and callers who used challenge calls. And I felt smart enough to know the difference. I was one that used challenge calls. I wasn't really a challenge caller. But my small group, 2 or 3 squares of C1 and then C2 dancers, they danced challenge to tapes. And then they came to my workshop so they could dance. I did singing calls every tip, even at C2. And they loved to be able to dance using the calls they learned at their tape workshops, but just be able to dance them. These were guys that appreciated both ends of the spectrum, and I always appreciated them for that reason.
They're a rare breed now.
Yeah. That's because I don't call that anymore. No, there's actually, I know quite a few challenge dancers that still do traditional squares and contras because they enjoy both ends of the spectrum. I almost said something else.
You're getting tired, Don.
Yeah, I had to set my alarm earlier than usual so I could get up and watch the game. The first half, anyway.
Well, Mel still has the game going on tonight, right?
Wouldn't know.
The Socceroos, the Australian, you're playing against.
Yeah, they're still in it. I have no idea who they're playing, but I haven't really been watching it.
Game starts in another hour. I'll be watching it. I have spent too much time watching World Cup stuff the last week. Nothing else is getting done. It was a shock to realize that we actually had this on the calendar.
I spent the last 4 weeks on emergency management response to the floods here, and be about I think on the 14th I go back. So,
I was glad you were saying. I thought you were going to say emergency room. I'm glad.
no, emergency response to the floods.
Good.
I was trying to explain. I think I was explaining it to Mark. He said, "Well, how much of the area is flooded?" And I said, "Well, if you go to the coastline of northern Washington State, head over to Oregon, and go about 2/3 the way down California, that's about the area that was covered in water."
Ugh.
We were looking at one of the bridges just here in Albury that we were going over, and it's about 14 feet higher than the water line. During the floods, the water was lapping at the bottom of the bridge. So, and that was like a wall of water moving across the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
That has happened quite often in the last couple of years, as we had it in the.
Yeah,
and not only once a year.
Yeah, we had floods up north, then we had the COVID. No, we had floods, then fire, then COVID. Now we're back to floods again. And the fire season is just starting. Yippee-yi-yay.
Cheers.
What do you think, guys? Should we call it for the week? For whenever we get around to another one of these. I keep forgetting how much fun it really is. Thanks, you guys, for joining in. It's a social group, just like we want square dancing to be.
Enjoyed it all very much.
Yeah.
I enjoy watching them, Don. I haven't had a chance to actually get into a few of these lately because of everything else going on, and I just had to cut back. It's a little early in the morning for me.
I can understand that.
I am always
I-
amazed when you show up.
I got a.
I was actually editing this month's edition of BTM, so that's what I was working on. I figured, oh, it's almost 2:00, time for Dawn's session. I may as well just join in.
There's quite a few people on the email list, one of them being Brian Hodgkiss, and he wrote back, I'd love to come, but 3 a.m. is not very good for me. And I wrote back, if it was 3 a.m. for me, I wouldn't go either.
All right. Well, I'm going to head out because I got
You
a couple
guys later.
hours. I'm going to see if
I
I
will
can get
too.
an hour and a half sleep.
See you
Bye,
guys.
everybody.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Later,
See you
Val.
later.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
guys.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Hi, Don. He's out.
Hey, Mike, didn't see you down there.